It's not like I ever dreamed of becoming a park ranger. Honestly, it was never a goal of mine. But I guess something deep inside me always drew me to the woods, the wild, unforgiving beauty where you face nature on its own terms. My dad used to take me there almost every weekend when I was just a kid. We'd venture far from home, into places where there weren't any trails, no signs of other people. He taught me how to build a fire, find clean water, and tell when the weather was about to turn. Those were real lessons, the kind that stuck with me. But everything changed when I turned 12. My dad fell from a cliff during one of his routine forest patrols. He was a forester, and that day, they told me, was just a regular route check. Only he didn't make it home. They found him 2 days later. I'll never forget the look on my mother's face when she got the news. After that, she worked herself to the bone, and I spent more time with Sarah, my little sister. I became her babysitter, protector, and later, when I got older, the provider. I picked up odd jobs wherever I could to give Mom a little breathing room. By the time I was 18, I was ready to leave our town. Not because I hated my family or the place I grew up, but because I couldn't stay where everything reminded me of who we'd lost. The army seemed like a good way out. They teach you discipline, give you a purpose, and leave you no time to dwell on the past. It was exactly what I needed. At first, it was just basic training, boot camp, constant yelling from sergeants, endless marches. But then they discovered I was good at certain things. The skills I'd picked up in the woods with my dad suddenly had value. I was good at navigating terrain, reading tracks, and finding paths where others got lost. That didn't go unnoticed, and a few years later I found myself in a reconnaissance unit. Our missions were tough, but I never complained. We spent weeks in the most remote areas gathering intel and slipping away like shadows. In the Middle East, for example, we operated in the desert, a vast, scorched landscape, nothing like the forests back home. I handled it well, right up until that day. We were on a mission when we got ambushed. The world erupted into chaos. Gunfire, shouting, explosions. I lost half my team. I managed to get the survivors out, but nothing felt the same after that. They called me a hero, but all I could think about was how to live with the weight of it. I came home with a medal but felt hollow inside. When I got back, everything felt different. The town had changed, and so had the people. Sarah had grown up, married, and moved to another state. Mom had aged, though she was still as strong as ever. But I couldn't find my place. Every day began with the same question. What now? Sometimes I'd disappear into the woods. It felt like the only place where I could breathe. One day, sitting on an old stump by the river, it hit me. Maybe this was what I needed. Nature had always been a part of me. I decided to turn it into a career. That's when I applied to Montana State University, enrolling in their Natural Resources and Environmental Conservation program. Going back to school after the Army felt strange, but I ended up enjoying it. I studied ecosystems, land management, and learned how to handle wildlife. An internship at Yellowstone tested me in ways I hadn't expected. I faced real challenges there, from rescuing lost hikers in the mountains to confrontations with poachers. Those were tough but exhilarating days. After graduation, I landed a job as a park ranger in a national park. It felt like coming home. The mountains, endless forests, and lakes, they reminded me of my childhood, but were even more majestic. My job was a little bit of everything: patrolling trails, monitoring wildlife, and taking part in search and rescue operations. Everything changed the day Will, my coworker, a guy in his 30s, burst into the station, his face pale and drawn, He didn't even bother to take off his hat, just blurted out in a shaky voice, "Jack, we've got a problem. One of the hikers is missing." I knew immediately this was serious. "Who?" I asked, already grabbing my jacket. "Young guy, about 25. He was with his girlfriend. She lost him near the old trail. Says they were walking along the creek and he stepped into the bushes to check something out. Never came back." The old trail. That place always made my skin crawl. The path wound along steep cliffs and snaked deep into the forest, where even seasoned hikers felt uneasy. It was too quiet there, like the place had a secret it wasn't willing to share. Even the birds avoided it. We didn't waste any time putting together a search party, me, Will, and 3 other rangers. The missing guy's girlfriend, Melanie, was a wreck. Her face was as white as chalk, her hands trembling despite her best efforts to hold it together. She explained that they'd been walking along the trail when her boyfriend, Tom, suddenly stopped, saying he heard something in the bushes. She hadn't thought much of it, assuming he'd gone to snap a few pictures. But after 10 minutes he hadn't come back. She called out, searched the nearby area, but he was gone, just like that. We started the search at the spot she'd pointed out. I led the way with the radio and map while the others followed behind, scanning the ground for any clues. About 30 minutes in, Will found something, a deep boot print in the soft earth. "This is his," Will said, crouching to examine it. "Looks like he left the trail." We followed the tracks downhill, toward the creek. The soil grew wetter and more treacherous, and that's when I noticed something strange. The forest. It felt different. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating, as if you could reach out and touch it. And the usual rustling of leaves and whisper of the wind, gone, replaced by a thick, eerie silence. "Could he have slipped into the water?" someone asked. I nodded. It wasn't uncommon, but deep down I knew that wasn't the answer. Something about this didn't feel right. We scoured the area around the creek, shouting his name until our voices cracked. But there was no sign of Tom, not a sound, not a trace. By nightfall, it was clear we needed to regroup. We headed back to the station to organize a full-scale rescue operation. The next morning, volunteers from nearby towns joined us, along with a couple of search dogs. It was a professional and impressive effort. We were sure we'd find him. But days passed, and the forest gave up nothing. The tracks we'd followed led to the edge of a dense grove, and there they stopped, just stopped, as if Tom had vanished into thin air. The dogs didn't want to go near the grove. They growled, whined, and pulled back on their leashes, their unease only deepening the pit in my stomach. It was like the forest had swallowed him whole, leaving not even a whisper behind. After a week, the search was called off. We'd combed every inch of that area, even places no one had set foot before, but it was like he had never been there. Tom was gone, erased from the world as if the forest had decided to keep him. A couple of days later, another person vanished. This time, it was an 18-year-old girl. When it happened, my boss called me into his office. His workspace was tucked away in the far corner of the administrative building, a plain door with peeling paint. I knocked, and a muffled "come in" followed. Inside, the air carried a faint scent of coffee and musty paper. The walls were lined with park maps and photos of rare animals, the kind you'd only spot if you were lucky or patient. Behind the desk sat Frank Miller, our chief ranger. He was in his 50s, a man who'd devoted most of his life to these woods. Normally calm and composed, Frank looked anything but that today. His face was etched with worry, deep shadows under his eyes, and the graying skin at his temples seemed darker than usual. "Take a seat, Jack," he said, gesturing to the creaky wooden chair opposite his desk. I sat down slowly, the chair groaning under me. It was old, like everything else in this building, and overdue for replacement. Frank's hands fidgeted with a pen, his gaze fixed somewhere past me, as though he was staring at something only he could see. That alone made my stomach tighten. "I've got bad news," he began. I frowned, bracing myself. What else could possibly go wrong? Starting tomorrow, we're closing the park. I almost fell out of the chair. Closing the park? What? Why? I asked, my surprise spilling into my voice. Frank hesitated, his lips parting as if to explain, but then he thought better of it. He let out a weary sigh and finally met my eyes. "Jack, this place, it's different. Things happen here. Strange things. We don't talk about it much, but every 20 or 30 years people start to disappear. Not just one or two. Dozens. The last time this happened, about 20 people vanished. We've noticed the pattern, and now that it's starting again, the decision's been made to close the park. It's the only way to minimize the risk." I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. It sounded insane. "We don't know why this happens," he continued, his voice low and steady. "We don't know where these people go, but if we don't take action, it'll happen again." "And what does that mean for us?" I asked, keeping my voice as level as I could. "It means we're going to be busier. You know as well as I do that some people won't care about the closure. They'll sneak in anyway. Our job is to stop them. The park is going into lockdown." "Lockdown?" "Yes, and all personnel will be issued firearms for self-defense." "Firearms?" I couldn't hide my shock. "Are we expecting an attack or something?" Frank shrugged, the gesture heavy with uncertainty. "I don't know. Anything's possible. It's better to be prepared." His words hung in the air, cryptic and unsettling. I could tell he wasn't sharing everything he knew, but prying more out of him wasn't an option. His expression said the conversation was over. I stood, nodded, and headed for the door. "Stay sharp, Jack," he called after me. As I left his office, my mind raced. What the hell was going on here? It was all too strange, too surreal. I returned to my work, but that lingering feeling, like I was standing on the edge of something far bigger than I could understand, refused to let go. I returned to Will, still turning Frank's words over in my mind. Something about it all felt wrong. He was clearly keeping something from us, but what? When I told Will about my conversation with Frank, he frowned, silent for a long moment. "Well, orders are orders," he said at last. "Let's just do what needs to be done." We spent the rest of the day preparing for the park's closure, hanging up warning signs, posting notices around the perimeter. It took the entire day. The next day was even more chaotic. Crowds of tourists gathered at the gates, furious that their plans had been abruptly canceled. They argued, shouted, demanded explanations, but we stuck to the task. When the stream of visitors finally dwindled, we went back to our duties. We continued the search for the missing girl, but after another week of combing the woods, it was clear we weren't going to find her. She was officially declared missing. Deep down, I knew the chances of finding her were gone. Life settled into an uneasy rhythm. Will and I patrolled the perimeter daily, keeping an eye out for trespassers, because of course some people couldn't resist the temptation to sneak in despite the warnings. At the same time, we kept searching for any trace of the missing hikers, but it was like they'd been swallowed whole by the forest. One afternoon, as usual, Will and I split up to cover different sections of the park. I wandered deeper into the woods, where the forest grew denser and darker. Towering pines stretched endlessly toward the gray, overcast sky. Fallen trees lay scattered like toppled giants, their moss-covered trunks sinking into the damp earth. The air was heavy, humid, as if an invisible weight pressed down on the entire forest. I moved carefully, scanning my surroundings, listening intently. It was quiet, too quiet, not even the distant chirp of a bird. The forest seemed to hold its breath, watching me like a predator biding its time. Then, a sudden noise shattered the silence. My heart leapt, and I spun around. The sound came from the bushes behind me. The branches swayed, as if something large was forcing its way through them. I slipped the rifle from my shoulder, steadying it toward the source of the sound. The forest seemed to freeze, waiting to see what would happen. My mind raced. A wild animal? A wolf? A bear? Or something else? My fingers tightened around the stock of the rifle, and I forced myself to breathe evenly, staying as still as possible. The bushes parted suddenly, and out stumbled Will. I almost pulled the trigger. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. "Damn it, Will," I gasped, lowering the rifle. "You nearly gave me a heart attack." But my irritation quickly gave way to concern. Will didn't look right. His eyes were wide, almost wild, his face slick with sweat, and his lips quivered as if he'd seen something no one should ever see. His left hand clutched his right arm tightly, his rifle hanging limply at his side. What the hell happened? "Why were you running? We split up, remember?" I asked, my unease growing. He didn't answer. He just stood there panting, his chest heaving as though he'd sprinted a mile. That's when I noticed the blood seeping between his fingers, dripping onto the forest floor. "You're hurt, Will," I said, stepping closer. "Let me see." He glanced down at his hand as if only just realizing the injury was there. I pulled the first aid kit from my bag and gently pried his fingers away to inspect the wound. What I saw made my stomach churn. It was a bite, not a deep one, but unmistakably human. The edges were jagged as if whoever or whatever had done this had torn into him with feral desperation. It was strange. No. More than that, it was downright absurd. Who bit him? A monkey, or something else entirely? My head was spinning with questions, but one thing was clear. I had to get Will back to base and have a doctor check him out. We trudged back slowly. He clutched his bandaged arm, and I stayed close, listening to every sound around us. The forest was too quiet again, like it was holding its breath, or worse, like something was watching us. Finally, Will seemed to come around. His breathing evened out, and he started talking, staring straight ahead like he couldn't bring himself to meet my eyes. "It was a woman," he began. "I was doing my usual patrol through the woods when I heard a noise by the creek. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote. But then I saw her." "Who?" I asked, though I already felt that gnawing sense of dread, like whatever he was about to say would make my hair stand on end. "A woman. Naked. She was sitting by the water, looking for something in the stream." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "She was stunning, but strange. I can't explain it." I stayed quiet, letting him gather his thoughts. I was embarrassed, of course. I walked closer and asked what she was doing, tried to explain that the park was closed. But it was like she didn't even hear me. She just sat there staring into the water like I didn't exist. His voice dropped to a whisper. I got closer to repeat myself, and that's when she stood up. And she revealed herself completely. I turned away, told her I'd give her my jacket to cover up. But then I felt it. Something clamped onto my arm. He gritted his teeth, reliving the moment. It was her, but her face. Damn it, Jack. It wasn't human. Her eyes, they burned like an animal's. And her face, it was distorted, like her bones weren't shaped the way ours are. "What did you do?" I asked, feeling the icy creep of fear crawl up my spine. I shoved her off, and I ran. I don't even know why. It was pure terror, something primal. I didn't look back. I just ran as fast as I could. And, it's the weirdest part? She didn't chase me. He went silent, licking his lips like his throat had gone dry from the story. When I got to the clearing, everything felt like it was spinning. I didn't know where I was running to. I just wanted to be as far away from her as possible. I didn't say anything, though inside everything was turning upside down. His story sounded insane, but I could see it in his eyes, hear it in the tremble of his voice. Will wasn't the kind of guy to make up something like that. We finally reached the base. Will looked better, but I wasn't taking any chances. I called the doctor, and within half an hour, we were in the small medical outpost. The doctor, an older man with silver at his temples, examined Will's arm carefully. "It's a bite. Shallow, but it looks human," he said, adjusting his glasses to inspect the wound more closely. "Who did this?" I gave him a brief explanation, skipping over the part about the woman creature. The doctor shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and got to work. He cleaned the wound thoroughly, applied a fresh bandage, and gave Will a series of shots, including a rabies vaccine. "Better safe than sorry," he said, wiping his hands with alcohol. "Rabies is no joke, and in cases like this, you can't be too careful." When everything was done, I walked Will back to his place so he could rest. He looked exhausted but seemed to be coming around. "You sure you're okay?" I asked before leaving. He nodded, though not very convincingly. I decided to check out the place Will had described. Something about his story wouldn't leave me alone, and if there was even the faintest chance of finding evidence, I had to take it. As I made my way through the woods, I stumbled upon tracks. Human tracks. They were faint but visible, pressed into the soft earth. Proof that Will had been telling the truth. Damn, what could this mean? I spent a long time examining the area, but there was nothing else. Could it have been the missing girl? No, Will would have recognized her. He'd seen her photo dozens of times during the search. That meant it was someone else. But who? No answers, only more questions. After scanning the area one last time, I realized it was time to head back. The forest was sinking into twilight, and staying out there after dark wasn't a smart move. On my way back, just off the trail, I noticed something lying in the grass. It looked odd, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. As I got closer, I saw it was a thick notebook, its cover worn and tattered. I picked it up, opened it, and was immediately hit by the musty scent of old, damp paper. Inside were handwritten notes, strange sketches, and diagrams. At first glance, it looked like a rough draft for a novel or a journal. Maybe someone with a vivid imagination had left it behind. I flipped through a few pages before snapping it shut, deciding to take it back to the base. Maybe the owner would come looking for it. Once I was back, I tossed my gear and the notebook onto the table and grabbed a quick dinner. Then I packed some food for Will. He definitely needed the energy after everything he'd been through. When I got to his house, the windows were dark. That immediately set off alarm bells. I knocked, first softly, then louder. No response. I tried the door. It was unlocked. When I opened it, a heavy, stale smell hit me. The air inside was thick, like the place hadn't been aired out all day. "Will?" I called, stepping inside and glancing around. In the bedroom, I found him. He was lying on the bed, his face pale and slick with sweat. I knew right away he had a high fever. He barely reacted to my presence, mumbling something incoherent without opening his eyes. "Damn it, Will," I muttered, lifting him under the arms. Wasting no time, I got him into my car and drove to the nearest hospital. His condition was worrying, and I wasn't about to take any chances. The doctor on duty that night quickly took him in and examined him. Will was semi-conscious, burning up with fever, but he managed to mumble a few words. The medical team hooked him up to an IV, gave him fever reducers, and administered a few more injections. "He's severely weakened, but it's nothing critical," the doctor said. "We'll keep him under observation until morning. You're welcome to stay if you'd like." I stayed. I sat by his bed, listening to the monotonous beeping of the monitors and watching as Will battled whatever strange illness had taken hold of him. The night dragged on, endless and oppressive, but by morning his condition began to improve. His fever broke, his breathing steadied, and he opened his eyes, weak but lucid. "Jack?" he rasped. "I'm here, Will. You're going to be okay," I said, feeling a weight lift off my chest. He nodded faintly and closed his eyes again, this time just to rest. I returned to the base only at dawn, exhausted but carrying a strange sense that this was just the beginning of something much larger. The next day, Will looked as though nothing had happened. It surprised me. Just yesterday, he'd been burning up with a fever, barely able to speak. But now he was full of energy, waving his arms around and cracking jokes, as if his condition had been nothing more than a bad dream. The doctors, of course, insisted he take a few more days off, but Will was stubborn, like an old bull. 2 days later, he was back, ready for work, though I couldn't help but keep a cautious eye on him. We continued our patrols through the forest, often circling back to that strange woman. Will joked about his crazy encounter, but I could tell he was still trying to make sense of it deep down. Who was she? Why had her face been so distorted? We came up with theories, but none of them felt satisfying. Eventually, we settled on the idea that she might have been a sick woman or some lost soul no one knew about. Life carried on. The restrictions worked. Tourists were almost completely gone. The forest grew quiet, peaceful even. Too peaceful. At times, the silence felt oppressive, as if it was hiding something just out of sight. That evening, I returned from my shift, tired and a bit out of sorts. I sank into my chair, closed my eyes, hoping to clear my head for a few minutes. When I opened them, my gaze fell on the notebook I'd found days ago. It sat on the table, almost as if it were waiting for me. Out of boredom and growing curiosity, I decided to flip through it. No one had come forward to claim it, and I figured there was no harm in taking a closer look. What's the worst that could happen? I thought, opening it. The entries were fascinating. The first few pages described how the forest wasn't what it seemed. The author appeared to be a researcher or someone deeply invested in studying the area. They wrote about strange anomalies, unexplained phenomena, and creatures that supposedly lived within these woods. The descriptions were vivid and detailed. Whoever had written it clearly had an active imagination. For a moment, I dismissed it as nothing more than creative fiction, perhaps the work of an aspiring writer who had wandered these trails for inspiration. But certain details in the entries made my skin crawl. The first 5 pages spoke of forbidden places. The author warned readers to avoid these areas at all costs. They described strange sounds emanating from those spots and shadows that seemed to watch them. One of these locations was alarmingly close to the area where Will and I had split up that day. I closed the notebook, feeling a flicker of unease mixed with curiosity. It all sounded like pure fantasy. But the thought of checking out one of these places lingered in my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. Well, I'll find out tomorrow, I thought, setting the notebook back on the table. Then I stood, grabbed my jacket, and headed home, trying to push thoughts of shadows and forbidden places out of my mind. The next day, as I headed out on patrol, I brought the notebook with me. It had become a sort of map to the fantastical world its author had described, and I decided to give it a chance. The location mentioned in the notes was near one of the streams that rarely caught the attention of tourists. There were no trails leading there, and I'd only been in that area a handful of times myself. After about 30 minutes of trekking, I arrived. The forest here felt denser than in other parts of the park. The tree branches intertwined overhead, blocking most of the sunlight, and the stream flowed lazily, reflecting shards of sky in its calm waters. Looking down, I noticed tiny amphipods darting about beneath the surface, their translucent bodies barely visible. I opened the notebook again and reread the description. The author claimed that if you followed the stream and turned right into the thickest part of the forest, you'd find strange plants invisible to the casual observer. They called them blood vines. I followed the instructions, but all I saw were ordinary bushes, trees, and overgrown grass. Glancing around, I smirked to myself, thinking how foolish this all was. The notes mentioned something peculiar. To see these plants, you had to stand sideways to the stream and use your peripheral vision to scan the thicket. The author claimed humans had a hidden visual mechanism that activated when we thought we saw something out of the corner of our eye. It wasn't an illusion, they insisted, but a latent ability to perceive what normally remained unseen. I chuckled to myself. What a load of nonsense. But as they say, nothing ventured, nothing gained. I positioned myself sideways to the stream, which burbled softly to my left, and began glancing at the woods out of the corner of my eye. At first there was nothing, then nothing again. "Jack, what the hell are you even doing?" I muttered under my breath, feeling ridiculous. And then something flickered. My heart jolted, freezing in my chest for a moment, and I whipped my head around. But there was nothing there, just the usual bushes and trees. "What the hell?" I exhaled, a shiver creeping up my spine. I turned sideways again, determined to replicate what I'd just seen. I scanned with quick, fleeting glances, over and over, and then I saw it. This time I moved slowly, cautiously, afraid that any sudden motion might shatter the illusion. But it didn't vanish. Before me, hidden among the bushes, were twisted, grotesque vines. At first glance, they resembled the roots of trees, but only at first. Their surface was a deep, dark red like dried blood, and they appeared slick, almost wet. A faint, metallic smell like iron wafted through the air, reminiscent of a room where someone had recently bled. The vines pulsed faintly, as if they were alive, emitting a barely audible squelching noise. Hanging from some of the vines were what looked like flowers, thick, fleshy buds oozing a crimson liquid that dripped slowly onto the ground. The soil beneath them seemed saturated with the grotesque substance, dark and damp. On the tips of some of the vines were thin, finger-like tendrils that moved lazily, almost as though they were reaching out for me. I stood frozen. My legs felt rooted to the ground, and my throat had gone dry. This couldn't be real. It was too vile, too wrong to exist. I took a step back, but the sensation that something was watching me wouldn't let go. The vines didn't move, but it felt as if they were aware of me, as if they were waiting. The metallic smell grew stronger, almost suffocating, as if the plants could sense my presence and were trying to draw me closer. "Leave. You need to leave," I told myself. But something kept me there. I extended a hand toward one of the vines, my curiosity warring with a deep, primal fear. But at the last moment, I yanked it back. The sense of danger was too overwhelming. I turned around and slowly stepped back, trying not to make any sudden movements. When I glanced again at the spot where those grotesque plants had been just moments ago, they were gone. Nothing was there, just bushes and ordinary trees. I exhaled, but it brought no relief. Everything inside me screamed that I had seen it all. I could recall every detail of those horrifying, almost alive vines, their dark crimson color, the sickening pulsing, the smell of blood that seemed to linger in the air. It was too real to be an illusion. Closing my notebook, I hurried back to the base. But my mind was in turmoil. You know that strange feeling when reality suddenly starts to crack at the seams? When you're living in one world and then something happens, flipping everything upside down? I think that's what people feel when war breaks out in their country. Just yesterday, you were sitting in a Starbucks, sipping coffee, discussing future plans, and today you're hiding in a basement wondering if you'll survive the day. Will you die in a bombing or perish in a trench? And everything that once made up your normal life just ceases to exist. That's what happened to me. Yesterday, I lived in a world where everything made sense. The forest was just a forest, the notebook was just someone's peculiar diary, and my job as a ranger was a routine I handled daily. But now that world had shattered, leaving me face to face with something I couldn't comprehend. My mind desperately tried to convince me that none of it was real. That I was tired, stressed out, that maybe the light had played tricks on my eyes and the smell of blood was just a figment of my imagination. But I knew the truth. I had seen them. Those grotesque, horrifying blood vines, they were real. When I returned to the base, my legs felt like lead. After shutting the door behind me, I tossed the notebook onto the table and poured myself a glass of water. But even after drinking it, I couldn't calm down. There was a burning tension inside me, and I realized I couldn't just let it go. I sat down at the table, opened the notebook, and started reading. This time, I looked at the entries with fresh eyes, every word, every description. The author wrote about forest anomalies with an obsessive meticulousness, as if they had seen things no one else could. I flipped through page after page, losing track of time. The author of the notebook remained a mystery. Its pages bore no name, no dates, not even a hint of who they might have been. The entries began with a simple assertion. This forest was no ordinary place. It hid more than met the eye. The author described creatures that seemed to have stepped out of nightmares, but their accounts lacked the air of fantasy. The words were precise, as though they were documenting facts, not spinning tales. Each page revealed something new, but what struck me the most was the description of beings the author called Two-Faces. From their words, these were shapeshifters, creatures capable of transforming from beast to human. The author claimed they hunted people, lured them into the forest, and abducted them. But why they did this, they couldn't say. The author had only seen them fleetingly, sometimes catching their human form, other times their animal guise. Each time, they left before being discovered. There were no instructions in the notebook about how to fight them, only grim warnings to stay away. These creatures, the author insisted, didn't always appear. They emerged to hunt every 25 to 30 years, and this particular detail set my thoughts racing. These two faces. Could they be connected to the recent disappearances? It all lined up. The periodicity of their appearances, the chilling descriptions of their hunts, and the strange cases of missing persons that had started cropping up in our park. I realized that the woman who attacked Will might have been one of them, and he was incredibly lucky to have survived. I spent the evening wrestling with what to do with this information. The notebook was clear. Stay away. But how could I avoid the forest when I didn't even know where these things might appear? And how could I tell Will what we might be dealing with? He nearly died because we didn't know. I couldn't let it happen again. At some point, an idea struck me. Maybe I should show him the notebook. Let him read the entries for himself, see that this wasn't just some wild story. Then we could go together to one of the places the author described, prove that this was real. Maybe then he'd understand the danger and be more careful. With that thought, I closed the notebook, set it on the table, and lay down, but sleep didn't come easily. I stared at the ceiling, feeling as though the forest outside our base was watching me. I knew those creatures were out there somewhere, and next time, they might be closer than I'd like. The next evening, I finally mustered the courage to show the notebook to Will. He was sitting by the window, staring into his cup of coffee when I placed the worn diary in front of him. "What's this?" he asked, glancing up at me. "Just open it." "Take a look," I said. He flipped through a few pages, pausing at the sketches and brief notes. The further he read, the wider the smirk on his face grew. "Come on, Jack, this is nonsense. Do you actually believe this? Werewolves? Blood-sucking plants? It's like the plot of a cheap horror movie." I tensed, irritation bubbling up inside me. "Yeah, I believe it," I said firmly. "Because I saw it myself. I was at that creek. I saw those vines or whatever they were. They pulsed, they stank like hell, and they moved. You think I made all that up?" His expression darkened, though he still looked skeptical. "All right. Let's say I believe you saw something. Are you telling me this notebook is legit? That these creatures are actually out there?" "Yes. And I think that woman you encountered was one of them." He shook his head, staring back at the notebook. "Jack, I don't know. It just sounds too crazy." "You'll see for yourself tomorrow," I said, determined that we needed to check it out together. We agreed to head out first thing in the morning. The next day we got up early, the forest still cloaked in a faint morning mist. We packed our gear, checked our radios, and brought knives and rifles, just in case. Will didn't look great. His face was pale and his eyes seemed distant. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded, unconvincingly. "Yeah, just a bit of a headache and... damn, this itch won't go away." "Itch?" I asked, frowning. "Yeah, after that bite. My arm doesn't hurt anymore, but now it feels like something's gnawing at me from the inside." "Maybe you should see a doctor." "I'm fine," he said dismissively. "Let's just get this over with." I didn't argue, though his words made me even more uneasy. When we reached the creek and the grove, the sun had risen, its rays filtering through the branches. The forest around us was quiet, the only sound the babbling of the water. I showed Will what to do. Stand at an angle to the creek and look at the thicket out of the corner of his eye. "This is stupid, Jack," he muttered, but followed my instructions anyway. The first time, nothing. The second time, still nothing. We kept trying until Will suddenly straightened and leapt back. "Jack, what the hell was that?" "You saw it?" I asked, adrenaline surging through me. "Yeah, I saw it, those things." Now we both stood there, gripping our rifles, staring at what had revealed itself to us. Among the bushes, the blood-red vines had appeared again. They pulsed, oozing a dark, viscous liquid that looked disturbingly like blood. Their tendrils moved slowly, writhing as if alive, and that same sickening metallic stench filled the air. This can't be real," Will whispered. "It's real," I said, though I could hardly believe it myself. We tried to take pictures. I pulled out my phone and snapped several shots. But when I checked the screen, there was nothing, just ordinary bushes. Will tried the same with identical results. "This is some kind of damn magic," he muttered. "Or something we just don't understand." I said, pocketing my phone. We stayed there for a few more minutes, watching those grotesque plants, but eventually decided not to linger. The longer we stood there, the stronger the feeling grew that the forest itself was watching us. On the way back, I began sharing my suspicions with Will. "I think that woman you encountered was one of them. A two-face," I said. "These creatures can disguise themselves as humans to lure in their prey. And you think they're behind the disappearances?" "Yes. How else do you explain them coming out to hunt every 25 to 30 years? Will didn't reply, but I could tell he was starting to take it seriously. "We need to be more careful," I added. "Especially now, with the park closed and hardly anyone around." By evening, we were back at the base, exhausted, but still processing what we had seen. After dinner, we each went to our rooms. Will looked lost in thought, while I felt like the shadows of the forest had crept into my mind. Lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cursed woods were hiding far more than we'd uncovered. Sleep didn't come easily. I was almost asleep when I heard a strange noise coming from the next room, where Will was sleeping. It was a scratching, grating sound like claws dragging across a wall. I opened my eyes and sat up in bed, straining to listen. Maybe Will was just moving furniture or accidentally knocked something over. But the noise came again, louder, sharper. It sounded like something, or someone was clawing at the walls. "What the hell?" I muttered, a chill crawling down my spine. Then came a dull thud, as if something heavy had fallen. My heartbeat quickened. I got up, walked to the door, and knocked on Will's room. "Will, you okay in there?" I called out, but there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I jiggled the doorknob, but the door was locked. "Will, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. After a moment of silence, his voice came through, muffled, tense. "Jack, it's fine. Sorry for the noise." His words didn't sound convincing, but I decided not to push. "All right," I said, and returned to my room. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the unease the next morning. Over breakfast, I asked Will what had happened. "Nothing," he said with a shrug. "I was asleep and accidentally fell off the bed." I studied him, trying to figure out if he was lying, but all I said was, "It happens." The day went by uneventfully. We patrolled the woods along our usual routes, caught one trespasser, some stubborn idiot ignoring the restrictions, and let him off with a warning after writing up a report. Everything was calm, but that nagging feeling that something was off wouldn't leave me. That night, as I tried to sleep again, the sounds returned. Scratching, faint but insistent, building in intensity. My chest tightened, and the instincts I'd honed during my years in the military screamed that this was no coincidence. I got out of bed, walked to Will's door, and knocked again. "Will? You there?" I called, but there was no reply. Suddenly a scream shattered the silence. Will's voice, filled with pure terror. My heart dropped, and I grabbed the doorknob, trying to force it open. It was locked. "Will, open the door!" I shouted, slamming my shoulder into the door, but it wouldn't budge. From inside, I could hear the sounds of a struggle. Thuds, muffled cries, a frantic scuffle. There was no time to wait. I threw my weight against the door again. The first hit did nothing. The second barely made it creak. On the third, it finally gave way with a crash, and I burst inside. The room was a wreck. The bed was overturned, furniture scattered, the window wide open. In that moment, I saw something, a dark, indistinct shape, leap out the window, dragging Will with it like he was a rag doll. His terrified eyes locked with mine for a split second before they disappeared into the night. I froze for a heartbeat. Then adrenaline surged through me and I bolted for the gun cabinet. Damn it, damn it, damn it, I cursed, grabbing my rifle and checking the ammo. Bursting out into the cold night, I immediately reached for my radio. Alert! We've got a situation. Will's been taken. Repeat. Will's been taken. Something attacked him. I need backup now. My voice cracked with urgency, but I couldn't stop. I headed for the woods, desperate to find a trail. The freezing air burned my lungs, but I ran, clutching my rifle with one question pounding in my head. Where did that thing take him? I held the shotgun in one hand and the flashlight in the other, casting its beam ahead to light my path. The pale light illuminated low-hanging branches, shrubs, and the occasional strange shadow that seemed to move but always resolved itself as a trick of the light. My heart pounded in my chest, my breathing heavy, but I pressed forward, focused on the tracks. The ground beneath me was damp and soft, leaving clear imprints. I spotted them first where Will's footprints were evident, and beside them deep impressions that resembled the tracks of some massive beast. Every second felt like an hour. I swept the flashlight back and forth, searching for any hint of motion. Then, suddenly, on the edge of the beam, something flickered, fast, indistinct, like a glimpse of something at the corner of your eye. It was dragging Will. I caught a brief, horrifying glimpse of his arm, limp and dangling. I broke into a run, leaping over roots and sinking into the spongy earth. But whatever had him was faster. The closer I thought I was getting, the farther it seemed to slip away. The flashlight's beam struggled to cut through the dense blackness of the woods. I clung to the faint trail left behind, marks in the wet soil. But then, just like that, the trail vanished. I found myself standing at the edge of a stream. The water murmured quietly, mocking me with its indifference. The tracks ended abruptly at the bank. I swept the flashlight across the area, inspecting the rocks, bushes, and sand. But there was nothing. It was as if everything had been erased. What now? I thought, my mind racing. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. The thing that had taken Will had disappeared into the suffocating night. I searched along the stream, pushing deeper into the forest, but it soon became clear it was useless. Nothing. No footprints, no sound, nothing but my own ragged breathing and the faint trickle of water. Defeated, I had no choice but to head back to the base. As I approached the station, an overwhelming wave of helplessness washed over me. It wasn't long before the others arrived. When I told them what had happened, they didn't ask too many questions. I could see the fear in their eyes. We contacted the police and rescue teams, and within an hour, an organized search began. The team was thorough, equipped with flashlights, dogs, and maps. We combed through the forest until dawn, calling Will's name, but there was no answer. When morning came, we were exhausted. After a few hours of rest, we went out again. The forest, less menacing under the daylight, still held an ominous air. The tracks were clearer now, but they still ended at the stream. Even the search dogs, who had been following the trail, stopped there, whining and circling in confusion. We searched until dusk, meticulously covering every bush, every path. But Will was gone. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. By the end of the day, he was officially declared missing. I stood at the edge of the same stream where the trail had gone cold, staring at the water. My head throbbed with exhaustion, and despair gnawed at my insides. I couldn't accept that Will was gone, but the reality was undeniable. He had disappeared into this cursed forest, taken by something that left no trace, and from which no one ever returns. The tracks I found by the stream that night were anything but human. Massive paw prints with long claws, like something a giant beast might leave behind. We took several photographs, hoping to later identify what creature they might belong to. But deep down, I already knew the answer. It was the two-faced. And the question that haunted me endlessly was, why had it taken Will? We never found my partner. Just like we never found the others who had disappeared. A month later, the park was reopened. The official story smoothed over, but for me, it was far from over. The hope of finding Will, alive or at least learning what had happened to him, never left me. A year passed. A year of endless questions, sleepless nights, and relentless walks through the forest, searching for any clue, any shred of evidence to explain this madness. Then one day, during yet another walk through the park, I noticed movement near the stream. Something darted between the trees. My heart pounded. It was the same place where Will had once met that woman. Instinctively, I tensed. Since that night, I always carried a weapon, and this time was no different. Slowly, I unslung the shotgun from my shoulder, preparing myself. I crept toward the stream, careful not to make a sound. The water trickled softly, but the air was heavy with an eerie silence, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Peering into the shadows, I saw a person. They were crouched by the water, naked, drinking straight from the stream like a wild animal. I froze, struggling to process what I was seeing. When I focused, my blood turned cold. It was Will. He looked gaunt, his skin smeared with dirt, his hair matted and hanging over his face. But it was him. There was no mistaking it. My partner. For a moment, shock rooted me in place as a whirlwind of thoughts rushed through my mind. How? Why? Where had he been all this time? But I forced myself to move. Slowly, step by step, I approached him, careful not to startle him. Will, it's me. Jack, I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. He jerked his head up, and for a fleeting moment, recognition flashed in his eyes. Our gazes locked, and I felt a tremor deep inside me. It was Will, but not entirely. His eyes were wild, alien, yet there was still a glimmer of the man I knew. Will, I said again. But instead of responding, he leapt to his feet and bolted like a spooked animal. Stop, Will, it's me. He didn't stop. He ran deeper into the forest, weaving through the trees with an agility that was almost inhuman. His movements were unnaturally quick, fluid, as if he was no longer fully human. I followed, crashing through the undergrowth, jumping over roots, branches whipping against my face. The shotgun felt heavy in my grip, but I wouldn't let it go. I tried not to lose sight of Will, keeping track of his figure flitting between the trees. He moved with astonishing speed, darting like an animal that knew every path, every hiding place. The forest grew denser, the air thicker, and even the sounds around me seemed to shift. The rustle of the wind disappeared, replaced by a sharpened silence, as if nature itself was holding its breath, watching our chase. And then, something strange happened. I crossed an invisible threshold, like passing through a veil that brushed against the edges of my consciousness. It was so fleeting I barely registered it. At first I dismissed it. But minutes later, as I ran, it hit me. The forest had changed. These trees were unfamiliar. Their trunks were massive, draped in thick moss that glowed with a faint, sickly green luminescence. The air was pungent with the stench of decay and dampness. The familiar trails of the park had vanished, replaced by narrow, suffocating paths bordered by low-hanging branches. I stopped for a moment, glancing around, and felt a chill creep up my spine. Where was I? This wasn't the forest I knew. This wasn't even the same world. But I pushed those thoughts aside. Will was ahead, somewhere in this alien wilderness. I had to find him. I had to bring him back to his family. I started running again, quickening my pace. The flashlight's beam danced erratically across the ground. Suddenly, without warning, something massive exploded out of the darkness. It hit me with such force that I was thrown to the ground, my shotgun slipping from my grasp. My head spun, and pain lanced through my chest from the impact. As I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. Standing before me was a creature, a grotesque, oversized rat, if it could even be called that. Its body was covered in greasy, patchy fur with bald spots exposing raw, ulcerated skin. Its eyes glowed a menacing red, brimming with hatred, and thick, dark saliva dripped from its gaping maw. Long claws raked the earth, and it let out a guttural, unnatural growl, a sound far too deep for any ordinary creature. I groped for the shotgun lying nearby, my fingers trembling as I grasped it and swung it toward the beast. It darted to the side, narrowly avoiding my first shot. The blast echoed through the forest. I fired again, but missed. The creature lunged at me, and I had to roll to the side, narrowly escaping its claws. It screeched and hissed, circling me, relentless in its assault. I scrambled to my feet, my pulse pounding in my temples. I waited, watching as the creature prepared to pounce again. At the last second, I raised the shotgun, aiming squarely at its chest. The deafening roar of the shot shattered the oppressive silence, and the creature let out a high-pitched scream, its body convulsing before collapsing. Its glowing eyes dimmed, and soon the forest was quiet once more. I stood over its body, my chest heaving, my hands trembling. What the hell was this thing? This forest wasn't the one I knew. It was hostile, alien, something far beyond my understanding. But there was no time for questions. I scanned the area, searching desperately for Will. His figure was nowhere in sight, but then I spotted something. Tracks in the damp soil. I crouched, angling the flashlight, and confirmed they were his footprints. I straightened, gritting my teeth. Fear churned in my stomach, but I forced it down. I wasn't stopping. Not now. Not until I found him. No matter what stood in my way. The forest around me was no longer the one I knew. It wasn't the forest where I had worked for years, patrolling trails and chasing off trespassers. This place belonged to another reality, a shadowy world that defied logic and crept into the cracks of sanity. Everything here felt alien, hostile. I thought back to that rat-like creature that attacked me. Its description matched the notes I'd read in the notebook. That could only mean one thing. I had stumbled into the very place the author had written about, the Shadow Forest. And now, I was standing in its heart. But why had Will run? Why was he naked with that wild, unrecognizable look in his eyes? My mind flashed to the bite he'd received a year ago. Could it have infected him? Changed him? Was he becoming one of them? These questions swirled relentlessly, but there were no answers, only a growing sense of dread. I followed Will's tracks, my senses on high alert. The forest grew more grotesque with each step. These trees weren't like any I'd ever seen. Their twisted trunks contorted as if they were in agony, their bark covered in bulbous growths that oozed a thick black substance. At times I could swear the trees were breathing, slowly, imperceptibly, but the air shifted around them as though they were alive. I came across the same vines I had seen earlier. They slithered quietly, as if they had their own malevolent will. Now that I could see them up close, I realized they weren't just vines. They coiled along the ground and up the trees, their surfaces riddled with tiny cracks that leaked a dark red liquid. The drops sizzled as they hit the soil, leaving faint wisps of smoke, like acid burning through cloth. I gave them a wide berth, not wanting to test what might happen if they noticed me. As I pressed forward, the forest only grew stranger. At one point, the ground beneath me softened, feeling spongy, like a thick layer of moss. But when I bent down to inspect it, I realized it wasn't moss at all. Tiny, writhing tendrils stretched up from the earth, curling and reaching as if they were trying to touch my boots. I recoiled, stepping back quickly, my stomach churning at the sight. Whatever this place was, it wasn't meant for people. Farther along the trail, I stopped dead in my tracks. Looming along the path were stone statues, scattered like silent sentinels. They were crude and unnatural, their forms human but grotesquely distorted. Their faces were frozen in expressions of agony, mouths open in silent screams. As I stepped closer, my stomach turned at the realization. These weren't just stone. Cracks lined their surfaces, and from those cracks seeped the same viscous black-red fluid as the vines. The air around them was thick with the stifling scent of metal, sharp and suffocating. What were they? People who had been trapped here forever? Or something that tried to mimic humanity but failed? I didn't want to know. I followed the tracks, my flashlight's beam darting over the ground as I kept my ears attuned to every faint rustle, every whisper of movement. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the forest itself was trying to resist my advance. Suddenly, something emerged from the bushes ahead. It moved slowly at first, as if surprised to encounter someone in its path. It was a werewolf. Its massive body was cloaked in dark, matted fur, but its face retained faintly human features, a grotesque blend of man and beast that sent a chill through my core. Its eyes glowed a predatory yellow, and long, jagged fangs protruded from its half-open maw. For a moment, it froze, locking its gaze on me. Its muzzle twisted into what seemed like surprise, but the pause lasted only a second. Then, with a guttural snarl, it turned and bolted, heading in the same direction as Will's tracks. "No, you don't!" I hissed under my breath, setting off after it. I sprinted through the forest, leaping over roots and struggling against the slick, muddy ground. The creature moved fast, but I didn't let it out of my sight. My flashlight's beam jittered wildly, illuminating fleeting glimpses of the forest. Then, abruptly, I lost it. I stopped, panting, my ears straining to pick up any sound. The forest had gone silent again, unnervingly so. I crept forward cautiously, my heart pounding in my ears. Out of nowhere, the beast lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. I managed to fire my shotgun, the blast grazing its foreleg. The werewolf howled, a guttural, blood-curdling sound that echoed through the trees. It recoiled, limping but still alive, and then turned and fled again. "You're not getting away this time," I growled, pushing myself to my feet and chasing after it. The creature was slower now, its injury evident in its awkward gait. I pursued it relentlessly until it disappeared into the darkness of a cave nestled between jagged rocks. The cave entrance was narrow, its walls slick with moisture that dripped into shallow pools. The stench of decay and damp earth hit me immediately. Inside, the dim beam of my flashlight revealed scattered bones, tattered scraps of cloth, and piles of straw and leaves, a makeshift lair. I moved forward, my shotgun at the ready. The werewolf was close. I could feel its presence. My footsteps echoed softly against the uneven stone. Finally, I found it, cornered at the far end of the cave. It crouched low, clutching its wounded paw, its glowing eyes still burning with hatred. Then I heard it, a high-pitched, grating whine that sent a shiver down my spine. The sound came from a shadowy corner of the cave. I raised my flashlight, illuminating a pile of straw and leaves. Something was moving there, writhing. Keeping the werewolf in my sights, I stepped closer. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was a child. A human baby, frail but unmistakably alive, buried within the makeshift nest. My breath hitched, and for a moment my mind reeled. What the hell is this? These creatures. They're taking children. Why? "Put it down!" I shouted, aiming my shotgun at the werewolf. But before I could fire, something flashed in my peripheral vision. Instinctively, I ducked, and another figure leapt between me and the werewolf. It was Will. He stood naked, his skin smeared with dirt, his eyes glowing the same unnatural yellow as the creature's. His body tensed, his stance protective, shielding the werewolf and the child from me. "Will, what are you doing? It's me, Jack. We need to get out of here," I yelled, my voice trembling with a mix of desperation and confusion. He didn't respond. His lips curled into a twisted grin, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. He wasn't Will anymore. The man I knew was gone, replaced by something feral, something inhuman. His eyes burned with a savage hunger, devoid of any humanity. "Will," I called again, hoping against hope to reach him. "It's me, snap out of it." But he only snarled, his breath heavy, his growl deepening as his body began to convulse. His shoulders hunched and his joints cracked and popped as his form began to shift. His fingers elongated, sprouting claws, while his jaw extended grotesquely, sharp fangs glinting in the dim light. Muscles rippled under his skin as fur sprouted. And within moments, the man I once knew was gone. Standing before me was another werewolf, larger, more ferocious, its eyes locking onto mine with primal rage. It all became painfully clear, like a flash of lightning illuminating a dark sky. That woman, she hadn't bitten Will randomly. She had cursed him deliberately, infecting him to ensure he would become one of them, to propagate their kind. And that child, it wasn't just a victim. It was their offspring. Now I understood why young people kept vanishing. They weren't just disappearing. They were chosen, turned, ensuring the cycle continued. When that child grew up, it would do the same, hunting for a mate to perpetuate the horror. Everything fell into place. The disappearances, their periodic nature, why the victims were always young. But now I faced an impossible choice. Should I end it here and now, kill them to stop this nightmare from spreading further? Or should I walk away, knowing that others would inevitably fall prey to them? I raised the shotgun, aiming it squarely at Will. He wasn't human anymore. He was a monster. Yet as I stared down the barrel, I saw something that made me hesitate. Will, or what was left of him, held the child close, shielding it with his body. The woman, his mate, watched me with eyes that seemed almost human, filled with a silent warning. Despite their monstrous forms, there was something undeniably familial about the scene. Twisted, unnatural, but still familial. Slowly, I began to back away, never breaking eye contact. I couldn't provoke them, not now. Will stood frozen, clutching the child. The woman's gaze followed me, her presence exuding a quiet threat, but they didn't follow. I stepped out of the cave, my legs trembling, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts as I tried to steady myself. And then I nearly stumbled into someone. I froze, staring in disbelief. It was Frank. Unlike Will, he was dressed, his expression calm but alert, as if he'd been waiting for me. A shotgun was slung over his shoulder, and a satchel hung across his chest. "Frank?" I croaked, my voice raw from the tension. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Quiet, Jack," he cut me off sharply, his eyes scanning the tree line. "We don't have time. You've stirred them up and they'll be coming. We need to move. Now." "Stirred up? What are you talking about?" I began, but the words died in my throat. Behind us, the bushes rustled violently. Frank tensed, his hand flying to his shotgun. We sprinted through the forest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Despite his age, Frank moved with uncanny speed and precision, his steps deliberate, his breathing steady. The forest around us seemed alive, closing in with every step. Behind us, I heard them. Branches snapping, guttural growls, the unmistakable sound of something giving chase. I raised my shotgun and fired blindly into the darkness. The blast shattered the eerie silence, but the creatures kept their distance, hanging back just out of reach. They weren't mindless. They were calculating, waiting for an opening. I caught glimpses of them darting between the trees, hulking shadows with glowing eyes, their movements unnervingly fluid. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, lungs screaming for air. Each shot slowed them down but didn't stop them. The forest seemed to thicken around us, as if it too were trying to trap us. My flashlight flickered, barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, we broke through. The air shifted abruptly. It was lighter, familiar. We stumbled onto a well-worn trail I recognized, and behind us the forest fell silent. Frank stopped, panting heavily, and turned to look back. "That's it. They won't follow us here," he said, his voice steady but low. You knew about this place?" I asked, my throat tight with disbelief and exhaustion. Frank nodded, his expression grim. His gaze was heavy, as if burdened by the weight of secrets he'd carried for too long. Suddenly, the notebook flashed through my mind. I stared at Frank for a long moment, sensing that he knew far more than he was letting on. "Frank," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "That notebook, was it yours?" He exhaled heavily and nodded. "Yes, I lost it. You found it?" "I did, but what is this place? How long have you known about it?" Frank's eyes met mine, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face, as though he were weighing whether to tell me the truth. Finally, he spoke. "About 30 years ago, a ranger who worked here before me told me about this place. It's a secret that's been passed down, ranger to ranger, but no one's ever dared to investigate it too deeply. I was the first to take that risk." "So you knew where those people were disappearing to?" I asked, anger bubbling in my chest. Frank shook his head firmly. "No, Jack, I didn't. Not until recently. By the time I put the pieces together, it was too late to do anything about it." I fell silent, turning his words over in my mind. This place, these creatures, they'd been known about for far longer than I could have imagined, but no one had ever stepped up to face them. Or maybe they were too afraid of what they'd find. "I'm sorry about your friend," Frank said quietly, his gaze dropping to the ground. "But there's nothing you can do for him now." I clenched my teeth, swallowing the retort that was forming in my throat. His words, though spoken with an air of sincerity, offered no comfort. We walked back to the station in silence, the weight of the night pressing heavily on both of us. Frank looked as worn as I felt, as though he, too, was struggling with the events we'd just survived. Since that night, I've never seen Will again. His image haunts me, the wild, feral look in his eyes as he stood between me and the creature with the child. It's burned into my memory, impossible to forget. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was all a nightmare. But deep down, I know the truth. It was real. And sometimes, especially on those unnervingly quiet nights, I feel like I'm being watched. The shadows in the forest grow too dense, the sounds too unnatural. It's as if someone, or something, is keeping an eye on me from the tree line. Maybe it's Will, or maybe it's one of the others, those who have long since left their humanity behind.